Okay. Hi, everybody. Apologies for the muting. So I just want to say a few quick thank yous, and then I'll introduce you to our panelists. First of all, big thanks to the Department of Communication for really spearheading these events with me, and especially to Laura Ellingson, who helped me find and identify all these fabulous people to be a part of this experience. And also Helen Otero, our fantastic department manager. SCU Presents, which is hosting the screening. Center for Arts and Humanities, which did so much work to make this happen. So big thanks to Michelle Burnham, Britt Keane, and Amy Randall. The SCU Disabilities and Chronic Illness Network is a co-sponsor. Thank you so much. Women's and Gender Studies, and the SCU Library. It truly takes a village. Oh, special shout out to Nicole Branch from the library. She's amazing, helping us put this together. And now on to our illustrious panelists. First, we have guest filmmaker Reid Davenport from New York joining us here for a few days. Our wonderful moderator, maybe you could just raise your hands because I'm doing this out of order. Molly King with the Department of Sociology. Laura Ellingson again from Communication and also Women's and Gender Studies. Mukta Sharangpani from Women and Gender Studies. Lazlo Pearlman from Theater and Dance, as well as Women and Gender Studies. Y'all are overrepresented here, I'm realizing. That's great. I'm all for it. And Sharon, Kelleher, Paralympian athlete and founder of BAWSI Rollers, a program of Bay Area Women's Sports Initiative. So I think we'll begin with the trailer and then jump right in, and we should be past the ad. So hopefully everything else is good to go. This is a trailer for I Didn't See You There. Is there a way, can anybody switch the lights off? Or we need to do this with lights? How is it up there? How's the brightness? You see it okay? I mean, okay. If it's easy enough, we'll do it. If not, we'll play it as is. Perfect. Thank you. That helps. Oh, that helps a lot. You. Oh, okay. Oh. Hello? 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 Hello?
Should I just use my teacher voice? Use my teacher voice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but not everyone can use their teacher voice. Yeah. I'm going to try to get. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can start with. Yeah. Thank you. Sure. All right. Is this okay for Zoom too? Will Zoom be able to hear me?
Hello.
Yeah, try that one again.
It worked?
Is it helping at all?
No.
No, it sounded like it did it. It lit up the screen and then it went off again. That battery, it says. It seems like it's not connected to the system. Maybe also need to have the volume turned up. Some things that go wrong, and one of them is not picked up, and number two is it is, but it's on sounds which could be why. Sort of seems to help a little bit. If I do this, if I put my mouth right against it, it sounds louder, right? It's very not COVID friendly, but yeah.
I will talk really loud into it. Okay, here we go. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we troubleshoot. Hopefully I won't blow your ears out here. I'm delighted by the representation we have here across many types of identities and fields of expertise and personal experience to talk about this incredible piece of work by Reid Davenport. Just as people with disabilities are rarely represented in the media, something filmmaker Reid Davenport is working to change with his incredible work. We are also not well represented in academia or in other positions of expertise or prestige in society. An estimated 1.5 to 4% of faculty members have disabilities, compared with 1/4 of the general US population. And Paralympians also do not receive similar support or attention as Olympians. So it's exciting to be here today with a wide variety of bodies represented, as well as so many areas of expertise. Lived experience of disability, as well as the fields of women and gender studies, communications, and theater and dance, and of course, film. So let's jump into some questions. My first question for our panelists is, people with especially mobility disabilities are often stared at in public. Yet often those with disabilities are overlooked in terms of our daily needs in society. How does this fit with the themes in I Didn't See You There?
I feel like on the last question, I'll be interested to hear what you all think. And this, I don't even know why I'm reading it. This one doesn't work.
I'm happy to get us started. I think to me, what really resonated as I was watching Reid's film, which we got to see ahead of time, it's remarkable. And what was really powerful to me is the way in which Reid it becomes either hyper visible or invisible in the way other people respond to him, which is not the same, but it has some overlap with my own experience of being an above knee amputee and the ways in which it seems between either people only look from here up and do not notice at all that I am clearly struggling to walk and that they maybe could give me a little space and not cut me off, or they are staring very openly at the difference in my body. And so I think that it's a duality that's been really expressed by a lot of people with disabilities and differences in their bodies, and that Reid's film helps by the ways in which the different segments are cut together, helps to reinforce that sort of sometimes extremely rapid ping pong between hypervisibility and invisibility.
Happy to go next. My meds are making me a little fuzzy, so I hope I have permission to read from my notes. I think I'm going to be talking a little bit about the parallels between queer activism and disability rights activism, specifically within the context of India. And in thinking about sort of the ways in which disabled bodies and queer bodies have often been both invisibilized and hypervisibilized at the same time. A perfect example of this is how intersectional identities made young, disabled, rural, non-college educated women both seen and unseen. In 1994 in India, when a huge scandal broke out and caused widespread outrage in what was arguably a watershed moment for disability rights activism. when a state government, the Maharashtra state government, again, supposedly one of the progressive state governments, forced hysterectomies on 21 cognitively disabled girl and women residents between the ages of 15 and 31 of the government certified School of Mentally Deficient Girls in Shirur. There was conversation around language violence for another time. The girls' parents supported the institution's decision as a good way to manage personal hygiene, emotional outbursts, and prevent pregnancy in women as a result of sexual assault, rather than pushing the institutions to implement systems to prevent sexual assault or to support women to manage their menstrual hygiene through training and assistance. To this day, in spite of the outrage and in spite of fairly progressive implementations put in place, many institutions still subscribe to drug-induced sterilization experiments because managing intellectual disability still continues to work along the notions of guardianship rather than the notion of rights or autonomy or consent. Of course, the US has a long history of coercive fertility control and reproductive rights violations, but again, that's a discussion for another time. So sort of thinking through the ways in which Reid's film so beautifully makes evident the ways in which things go under the radar and the things that kind of surface. I thought this would be a good example to think about bodies and how they become necessary to manage, but also necessary to forget about in terms of their
I did it with the kid. I did it with the
Well, I did the film. I could really relate to a lot of the things in the film, and one was definitely this feeling of being stared at but not really seen, you know, being looked at as someone who's different, maybe like a curiosity or just something unusual, but not really like seen as a human being. I can relate to that. I've experienced that myself. And I think it was really beautiful the way you were able to show that point of view to everyone.
So, yeah, I mean, I thought the film was stunning. I really enjoyed it. It's just beautiful imagery all around. It made me think about, so rather than, I have a question, which I don't know if you want to try to answer. And I've got notes too. So it made me think about Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's a disability rights sphere academic, and her notion of the relationality potential between the starer and the staree, thinking about the freak show, etc. also, and that she says that the staree might take charge of the gaze, might use the visual encounter to transform the discomfort. And I'm wondering, thinking about the way you're both in the film, you're both the starer and the staree, right? Because we're not seeing you, we're seeing the camera. And I'm wondering if there's ways in which the film kind of works with that duality.
Yeah, that's a great question. Rosemary Garland Thompson's analogy about the freak show was with this film. I think that this film is all about that relationship and all about trying to overcome that power. There's not everyone, but the way you can see me, you are looking at everyone, but you can not see me. It's similar to why I like to say I subject audiences to my behavioral thoughts without knowing them to see me, which is the opposite from when disabled people are seen and you're not heard. So it was about kind of basically reverse things. Thanks.
And I just add, I wanted to ask Sharon in particular, as I was watching the film and thinking about your experience as an athlete specifically, it really about how, in one sense, disabled athletes are claiming the gaze, right? By putting yourself like literally out there, whether that's a board or a field or, whatever you're competing. Can you talk a bit about sort of the athletic event as something to be watched, right? And how that relates to your more everyday experience that is in the shown more in the film? Sure.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. Can you hear me okay? I think for me, I acquired my disability when I was in high school. I was 17. I didn't grow up with a disability. So sports were always a big part of my life growing up. And then when I became paralyzed in a car accident, I really wanted to continue that. I didn't want to lose that part of my life that I love so much. And I think also for me, it was a little bit trying to prove to myself and prove to other people that I could still be capable of doing athletic things and that I could still do things with my body that maybe not everyone else could do. And sort of a way just to prove to whoever was watching, which was generally not very many people, but that athletes with disabilities can be, athletic and strong and powerful and all those things that I wanted to, believe that I was.
No.
I don't know if that answers.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. That intersects with gender that you brought up too.
Yeah, I think that leads really well into another question that we have, which is who we are as embodied people really shapes our experiences in the world and how we make sense of those experiences. How do your experiences in your specific bodies shape how you learn about and make sense of the world?
Yeah, so a couple of different points of my intersectionality. In the first instance, I'm a trans person, so I am living and I transitioned when I was 34 years old, and so I have experienced life presenting as female for a full adult kind of experience. And I still see the world through that lens. I don't walk around the world as a man with a male experience. I walk around the world, you could say, and I'm going to say this really lightly, but almost like stealth in a sense. I'm hiding in plain sight. I have my sort of female enculturation, which completely informs everything I do, and yet from the outside, I am treated as a man, and a white man to boot. I'm also Jewish, which makes it slightly different. Like, what does whiteness mean when you're Jewish? So all of these, I'm always kind of inside a non-normative identity, representing a rather normative one. And my whole outlook on the world is completely created by the duality of those two things. I get to see things through both lenses, through my experience and through what I'm projecting in the world. So you could say that the starer of me and the stare back from me are two completely different identity positions. And there's that done.
I'll take the crack on it. I can't make any promises. But I think in the film, if you watch it, the film is physically shown, or literally shows a physical point of view of a disabled person, which is me. And as that literal physicality affords so much more than the physicality of my work. Disability studies, you talk about how disability is not defined by a medical condition, but rather is defined by a reaction to that medical condition. It's similar in that, my point of view is that defined make sure it's being too bad, but it's about its effects, how I've seen effects, literally helps me, literally helps me, and not practically trying.
I was thinking about Molly's question about how we are making sense of the world, and appreciate very much Reid's view on that. I think one of the things that's really come to me as a professor, as someone who helps make knowledge and teach knowledge with others, that my body is a big part of how I create knowledge. I can't sort of do it somehow separately from my brain. So my first big study based on my doctoral work is called Communicating in the Clinic, but it might have been called Searching for Some Place to Sit, because I had a very fragile leg that was still being reconstructed and had been operated on about a dozen times at that point. And so one of the things I learned about clinics is that everybody has to cede any of the few seats that there are to the doctor. So if a physician wants a seat to make notes or to do any of their dictating, then it must be vacated. And I wasn't even one of the medical practitioners. I was a communication scholar studying the communication of the medical practitioners. So a lot of what I became aware of is whose body was accommodated and whose wasn't, and the ways in which patient bodies were accommodated and the ways that they weren't, the way even the clinic building had a huge window in the front. So the air conditioning was always way too cold because with all that sun coming in, it was assumed that everybody in the room must be very cold. And we were constantly having to get blankets for the patients. So the ways in which they were cold, I wanted to sit, the doctors were comfortable, the nurses were running always up and down. I think there were some really powerful ways in which it's not just that was my experience as I studied communication in a cancer clinic, but that it became a big part of what I reported in my study is, hey, people's bodies are doing really different things in this space, and in a lot of ways that we just take for granted as normal. So I just wanted to offer that as one example in which it's not just sort of my body's doing this, just as Reid's film really embodies his perspective. I want to challenge us to think about the fact that that's actually true of all knowledge production. We're all doing it from a particular position in the world with a particular type of body.
And that embodiment really shapes the kind of knowledge that is produced. Yeah.
Which is why we need more kinds of bodies, right? Producing those kinds of knowledges. So we get a lot of different kinds of questions asked and at least partially answered.
Speaking of having many kinds of bodies, many kinds of representation, the disability community is a very diverse community, and disabled captures a really wide variety of experiences. To what degree do you think that I Didn't See You There captures something universal, and to what degree do you think it captures something specific?
Reid, one of the amazing things about your film is how you give us the imagery to understand life in a specific context. For example, how a body might inhabit and navigate urban infrastructure. In this case, we see subways, trains, wheelchairs, ramps, elevators, cameras, monitored lighting, answering machines, the lettering on manhole covers, beautifully shot, but tools that are to a large extent enabling, empowering even in the space. These are access contexts available to the modern citizen living in the first world, and something that Indian activists are pushing for as necessities, not luxuries. Missing manhole covers, for instance, on Indian roads are death traps for many bodies disabled otherwise. That's a discussion for another time. As the film so beautifully depicts, these are both privileging and punishing spaces. And I want to take this idea of the leeways and limits of context and share how this dichotomy presents itself in queer and disability rights discourse in India. For instance, both queer and disability activists have leaned into the many LGBTQI and disability themes present in Hindu mythology. India is primarily a Hindu country, more and more so becoming that with nationalistic agendas. But thinking about the ways in which Hindu mythology presents opportunities to validate and legitimize their identity, there are many examples in the queer context: androgynous kings, cross-dressing princes, intersex or third gender characters, homoerotic encounters, for example, fire god, male fire god Agni, who accepts semen gifts from other male gods, or both gender manifestations, such as the Ardhanari Nateshwar, the coming together of Shiva and Parvati, the right half is male, the left half is female. In the context of disability, the celebrated sage Ashtavakra, whose name literally translates into the one with 8 deformities, the blind king Dhritarashtra, and I say blind in quotes, whose virility is demonstrated in his fathering 100 sons. His sighted wife Gandhari, who decides when she marries him to share his experience, and so on her marriage day blindfolds herself for all of her life. This quote-unquote sacrifice accrues her with the power to bless her firstborn, to armor her firstborn son to remain immortal as he sets out for war. If you're interested in the full story, I'm available afterwards. And many of us know of the beloved elephant god, Ganesh, the young boy with a prosthetic head. At the same time, there are stories and fables where a character's disability is a metaphor for deviance, cunning, and evil. So we see deep metaphysical significance and symbolism in these narratives, where characters with disability are also invested with magical, superhuman powers that they may use for good or for evil. There are limits to this mythological referencing and challenges and pitfalls, right? These discourses of marriage and mischief, of divinity and deviance, fail to address the very human experience living in an ableist world. These tropes find their way into bureaucracy and in policy. For instance, today, even today, official government documents, the census forms, iCards, etc., the official Hindi word for disabled is Divyang, which means the divine body. And the Prime Minister went on national TV to request people to use this word in order to give the community dignity. There was a huge pushback to this from the disability rights activists, because disability is not a divine gift. It is, in fact, a slippery slope between the divine and the freak, is what many disability rights activists reminded us. It misreads what dignity looks like in this context, what it should look like, and it exempts the state from ensuring accessible infrastructure and support and preventing discrimination. I want to quote the words of Nidhi Goyal, who's a gender and disability rights activist. She says, I think they have found another way to tell the disabled that you are not normal. First, you were less than those who are normal, which means you were abnormal. And now you are superpower, so you're super normal. The main emphasis they continue to make even today is that you are different and not like us. We are the regular normal population.
So for me, it's a little
hard to know what would be universal and what would be personal about this film, because for me, there was so much I could relate to personally. But I do think that anyone who has something that's a little bit different than the mainstream, I would imagine would feel somehow left out or excluded in a way from general society. So I think that's something a lot of people could relate to, whether it's having a disability or sexual orientation or ethnicity. I do think that's something, unfortunately, a lot of people do experience, is feeling not included in some conversations.
So I think my motivation, I thought about this question when I was making the film. And I think the first rule that I had, the first thing I thought about was this is a film for disabled people. We do not see or do not see characters that resonate with our experience. So first of all, I wanted to make this film for disabled people. But strategically, several entry points we have for people into my perspective and kind of hopefully keep them and my frustration as if they were born because they connected to this. So that was my vision. I don't know if it worked, but that was, I think that was our very strategic part of the process.
Thank you, Reid. And I know in that way, the film definitely made me feel seen as a person. On that note, how does mainstream cinema represent and how does independent cinema draw attention to these non-mainstream views of the world? I know we have several students of cinema in the audience.
So much easier to read. So thinking about the ways in which Indian cinema, mainstream, has thought about the disabled body, other than a few notable movies, mainstream Indian cinema, which actually has a lot of reach and impact on a population, many of whom do not have access to education and learn much about the world through film, have actually let us down. They have continued to perpetuate stereotypes of disability. Often, for instance, a particular disability is portrayed wrongly. For example, a character who's supposed to have autism expresses it as a mishmash of many other kinds of disabilities. Broadly, if one were to sort of look at that misrepresentation, it happens in 4 ways. The first is the traditional concept. This might be a little hard to digest for those of us not from that culture, but the traditional concept of disability and karma. And disability is perceived as a punishment for misdeeds in the past life or crimes committed by parents, ancestors. And you see that in the story form sort of emerge where disability is seen as a fate equal to or worse than death. So, for instance, in a battle where the hero finally meets the villain and discovers the villain is injured in a way that it disables him, the hero might walk away without following through on his previous plan to kill the villain, suggesting that the fate is worse than death anyway, so let this person be left to their misery. The second is disability as comic relief or comic interlude, usually cognitive disability, visual or hearing impairment, is used as trope here, or as social maladjustment, where the cunning uncle or the scheming aunt are often shown as somebody with a mobility disability. In India, it's called locomotive disability. And often these characters also depict some form of non-normative sexuality or what is depicted as perverse forms of sexuality. The third way this shows up is awesome heroism, right? Where the disabled person either might have a sixth sense. We recently saw this in Game of Thrones even, right? Or overcoming unbelievable hurdles to set something right. A representation which also activists call out for is inspiration porn. The fourth being disability as dependency. The disabled body is seen as a parasitic body, never able to function fully independently without support from the family, community, or the nation. Diasporic cinema has had some good moments, thankfully. One of the films that comes to mind is a film called Margarita with a Straw, which opens up a lot of gateways for some conversations around intellectual ideas of intersectional queer disability, visibility. The film depicts a protagonist with a joyous, lustful appetite for life, She's creative, she's smart, loved and respected by her family and her friends, and unabashed about her romantic and sexual interests and activities in both men and women. Sadly, however, the film falls into one of the big, great traps, what is called cripping up, right? A non-disabled actor playing a character with a disability. The film also falls into the same traps of thinking about alter sexuality, non-normative sexuality in ways that frighten the cishet community. For instance, biphobia is pretty prevalent. But new and emerging ideas around sort of the intersections between queer and disability activism has given rise to a whole bunch of new cinema that perhaps might be a discussion for another time.
And I think just one more important thing about Marina with the giant. That's super proud that the actress is a white woman who's playing a South Asian woman. So it's there are a whole host of problems with that film.
So how is mainstream cinema representing disability? Well, not very well, first of all. I think around, there's been a big move for not only folks with disabilities, but for gender non-normative folks, for trans folks, et cetera. There's been a fairly strong movement for changing that. There's been a lot of casting processes. We're starting to see representations happen in film. There is the idea, the activist idea of nothing about us without us is starting to take hold. It's a slow process. It also has to do, in terms of sort of mainstream fiction film, it has to do not only with the ability for casting folk to see folks of let's just say non-normative identities in the roles, but also for those folks to feel empowered enough to go to the trainings to get them to the point where they can actually go to the casting agents, where they can actually get those roles. So and that kind of work is happening. I've been sort of studying that a little bit over the last years. There's been a lot more inclusive acting classes in places like New York and Los Angeles and London. And slowly, and there's been some casting calls, some casting initiatives, specifically recruiting folks to come in and be seen by casting agents. It's very slow, but I think we're in a moment where it is starting to happen, and it is very much the nothing about us without us. So the independent cinema is driving that, because that's where people have been able to be the us that is not without.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I do have to say that I believe independent cinema has also perpetuated tropes to the degree in which, I mean, it's obviously not super, but they're more bad examples of disability great disability. So, I mean, there is enough fortunate that it's just start with non-disabled people creating space for disabled directors, actors, cameras, cable people, etc. Oh gosh. I have to think about it. Yeah.
I was just going to add that the representation of people who've been disfigured or have a disability as the bad guy in a lot of the origin stories in the Batman universe and the Marvel universe. What I think we really need more, in much the same way when they started having queer or gender non-conforming characters, all those characters did all day was sit around being queer, being gender nonconforming. They didn't let them be whole people, right? And they've done the same thing with characters of color. They've done it with any kind of sort of outsider status. And I think we need more people with disabilities hanging out and doing something other than just being disabled, right? The character needs to be a full person who does stuff. There was a show on years ago now called Life Goes On that had a character who had Down syndrome and was played by an actor with Down syndrome. And it was on like in the late 80s, early 90s kind of thing, a long time ago. And since then, I don't know of Normal, which was a short series based on an autobiography that was on Netflix, portrays a queer white man who lives with cerebral palsy.
Special.
I'm sorry, Special. I think there's another one called, I was thinking of Atypical. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Anyway, he did a great job, I thought, of, again, trying to have a whole life, right? Having the character be complex. So I look forward to more of that kind of representation in mainstream cinema. They need to let disfigured people Ryan Reynolds is one of the most beautiful people in the world, right? So they scar him up and make him into Deadpool instead of having somebody who perhaps has a scarred body play Deadpool. If you're going to be in that outfit the entire time, where they can't see your face, right? Maybe somebody else could play it besides Ryan. Not to put Ryan down. He's, I'm sure, lovely.
Yeah, that was one of the things I appreciated about Reid's film, is that in addition to showing us a lot of what it's like to experience life with a disability, he's also just doing normal things like washing his glasses that, a lot of people just got to do to live life. And so, that was, it was a very well-rounded experience in that way. Catching flies, like sometimes you just got flies in your apartment and you got to deal with them. So.
Thank you. All right. Well, with that, we'll turn it over
to some questions from the audience and from our viewers online.
What would you say are like the main criteria that you'd like to see filled in a film about disability representation?
Hi. I don't think it's on this for voice to enter it. I think the solution should have to disabilities are about and not about disability. It's very easy for us to gravitate towards the voices that are disabled and to kind of subscribe to this mindset that you for disability should represent our community. Disability is like the definition of community, and to produce a lot more disabled filmmakers groups that we want to make.
And so, so sort of adding on to that, isn't it then more the criteria is what we don't want to see, I would say. We don't want to see all those tropes that we're talking about. We don't want to see all the people, disabilities represented incorrectly. We don't want to see non-disabled folk playing roles that disabled folk could play. We don't want to see non-disabled director making disabled films. I think that's a much clearer way to put it, rather than, because there is no monolith of what we want to make as artists, right? So to put that as that becomes a reductive artistic trap to say what do we want, but what do we don't want? We can say that, we can mark that.
Can people hear me? This is a little bit, I just thought of this, so it's rough. I'm thinking of the comment that Molly made about the low percentage of faculty who identify as disabled. And part of that, I expect is due to the lack of disabled people among faculty, and another part likely is for people who have so-called invisible disabilities who are not disclosing. And so switching industries from academia to film or to performance, thinking about the changes that everybody is arguing for in the people who are telling stories, acting parts, serving as cinematographers, etc., is for people like Reid, who are disability activists and who put that part of your identity first and foremost as a driving part of your art. What might it be like to work with some of these folks who have been like in the closet, so to speak, and the different ideas and experiences that people who are these sort of hidden insiders? Again, there's a question buried in here. Maybe if you want to take it up, please. If not, feel free to let it lie. But I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking particularly of the parallels that Lazlo, you drew to trans folks. That a number of actors of long stead have come forward as trans after being in film for decades as quote as non-identified trans people being perceived, cast, etc., as non-trans women, non-trans men. All right, again, this is a terrible example of my thoughts, your thoughts.
Well, I can sort of try to say something from the trans side, the monolithic one trans side that we all agree with. Which is kind of what I was going to say, really. Well, first and foremost, we bring our bodies to the work, regardless of whether what those bodies are representing is on the stage or in the camera. So the representation, so there's I think that there is meaning is created in that way, regardless of a level of outness, which, to put it shorthand. And I think that, and on the other hand, I would love people to just be out. Why is it a problem? Why, especially maybe if we're looking at the before times, if there is a before times where that would have gotten you not cast, and now that's not the case. So on both hands, on a trans perspective is that it's like we're there, voice is there, regardless of whether it's spoken out loud, and the more than that is spoken out loud, even if that's only on the backstage or camera side as opposed to the audience side, that changes things as well. That's different than and also related to the actual representation on the screen and on the stage. And they are both really important, and they both contribute in different ways. I guess the tipping point is if all the trans folks are stealth and they're not in any power to make the piece, then their impact is perhaps not as strong as it might be as if they were in the power position of making the piece, even if they were still not actively out. So there are layers. That's as far as I can get with that.
I appreciated your question in adding the fact that it's hard to know how to make visible something that's invisible. So there are a lot of people with various kinds of invisible disabilities, and film or any other medium risks an exploitive kind of spectacle kind of gaze instead of a good kind of gaze whenever they try to highlight something that normally passes under the radar, often at great cost to the person who is doing that survival and suffering without the assistance that they could probably benefit from. So I think it raises great questions for visual representation that I definitely am not a visual artist, can't answer, but I think as someone who would like to see more appropriate representation, I think they've started to do a better job with mental illnesses in popular culture as well. And I hope that continues on to things like autoimmune disorders, for example, but that are not immediately visible.
Hello. Okay. It's interesting because I had a class with Professor Pearlman right before this. We were talking about how often disabilities are, or people with disabilities are reduced to their disabilities and their experience with that. And my question is, while it's incredibly important to have panels like this and to have discussions, do you ever wish, or is it ever frustrating to be approached and asked to speak at something purely because of your experience with disability? Is it ever frustrating that you can't just be a person at the panel, but that you're asked again and again to talk about your experience as some sort of example?
It always is. Every single time. It's never going to be organized. And I think that as a disabled person, it's come to really identify as disabled, but that is in response to society's emphasis about disability. So it's a recognition of the work, but it's also rejecting it because society has saved it. So it's a very complicated people. How I try to cope with the society is to change the ableism exists.
So I think for me, with my experience playing tennis, I did a lot of interviews, and I think it was Laura or Mukta talking about inspiration porn, and it was always super frustrating because instead of writing about my sport, they would write about me as someone who overcame this huge challenge in life, and isn't that inspiring, and what a great story that makes us all feel good. And it was hard to always see it like in the life section and never in the sports section, when I really just wanted to be seen as an athlete.
So building off of the previous question and what was mentioned previously, do you see the expansion of disability filmmaking or films about disability in a way where you're trying to build it into normative filmmaking, where it's kind of something that's experienced or not seen as different? Or do you want it to be distinguished as its own genre or as disability films? And with that, is there a concern that by classifying a film as something focused on disability, that it'll kind of make stereotypes appear around what a disability is?
It's a terrific question, and it has to be both ways. It has to be big blockbuster movies, and it has to be really
Other questions? I have a question.
Thank you all so much. My name is Britta Buxer. I'm an assistant professor in child studies, also a queer person, and just really appreciate this panel and the conversation so far. In child studies and my courses, we take time to think about the social construction of knowledge and positionality. And also we think about representation in children's literature and the diversity of stories and why representation matters for children. I'm thinking about your work, Reid, and its importance, particularly for future generations. And I'm wondering if you all think about or engage with intergenerational kind of activism, or think about the way that the next generation might be able to be in a different world. Thank you.
Didn't know it was such a hard question, did you?
Bingo.
Thanks for the question. I've been nominated. I think it's a great question about the intergenerational piece. I study the social construction of knowledge and inequalities in how people with disabilities get knowledge. And I think that thinking about it from an intergenerational activism point of view is something that's really ripe given the rich history of activism in the disability community. It's something that I think we're only starting to appreciate with films like Crip Camp coming out, and how that has a lot to teach us over time in terms of learning from past disability activists about, what the best ways to move forward are. But I appreciate the connection between those ideas, but I don't have a better answer than that. Thanks.
I appreciate what Molly said, and would just add that I think there's some interesting intergenerational and perspectives on what we pay forward. And most of my activism has been under a banner of feminist activism, and disability is one of the places where feminists and disability activists can get pretty upset at each other, right? And some of that is generational over sort of reproductive justice and the lack thereof, and the way in which we have been sliding backwards in terms of how many rights are protected and what kind. And disability is often one of the issues around choosing to terminate a pregnancy, disability of the fetus. And then, which Mukta started with, the idea of trying to control the fertility of perceived disabled women, although rarely of disabled men, sometimes as well, but much more of the focus, not on preventing the sexual assault of women with disabilities, but instead making them unable to sustain a pregnancy following the taken for granted assault, right? So very problematic. And I think that that's generational, in that it has to do with parents raising children, right, who are facing these challenges, and then also people with disabilities having children, or choosing not to have children, which has also been, again, reproductive justice and inequality is just such a huge, I think right now, where the generational perspectives are really coming to connect. And obviously you're in child studies, right? So we probably aren't going to get into reproductive justice with really little children, but bodily autonomy, we do, right? And I think that would be a great way to talk about generational communication as a start, at least.
Okay, I think we only have time for one or two more questions.
I'm Pam Madden, pardon me, alum class of 66. But I worked for a company called DPI Services, our sister or brother company, Disabled Programmers Incorporated. So that company trained disabled people in how to program. Oh, phone's not working very well. Better. Yeah. And then once the person could do some programming, then our company stepped in and found jobs or consulting times for those people. Some of the people, again, had obvious disabilities, wheelchairs, and so on, moved forward or backwards in them. But it makes me wonder, when you're talking about the films and being invited to make a film that is specifically includes the idea of because of your disability. I was wondering, what about the entire cast had disabilities, internal or external, the entire cast. And yet in that, everybody was treated as though they were normally able to function. And I saw that a lot, of course, in the company. Just it's a matter of everyday experience. Oh, and then so it gave people a model of how they should treat people or could treat people with disability.
I am one exhausted of teaching people how to treat people with disabilities. Disability is the word I'm trying to make disability make disability better. You confusing to
All right. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. I think Lazlo Pearlman really helped us think about the relationship between the starer and the staree. Sharon, sort of valuable perspective on what it's like to be Reid, of course. I need say no more, provided a very valuable film for our discussion today. Mukta Sharangpani, emphasis on the need for structural supports rather than highlighting individual divinity in disability, I think is something I took away today. Then Laura Ellingson helped us think about embodiment, status, and representation. And I think one thing I'm thinking about during our discussion is that if your body doesn't sort of fit into the expected norms, there used to be only one option for engagement. Sort of being stared at in the sense of the circus freak show is the way to make a living, back in the good old days. And Reid's film sort of turns that around and does the looking, capturing the experience of disability out of everyday life for the viewer. And so in doing so, he offers us another alternative to staring, one I hope you'll take him up on and come to the film screening tonight at 7 p.m. in the Music Recital Hall. So thank you all very much, and I'll turn it back over to Nico.
Well, you've said it all. Thank you, Molly. And thank you so much to the panelists. And if you're a student in my queer cinema class, please just stay back for 1 second. And thank you all for joining us.